Pastors, you must make your church a harder target for AI scams. None of this is complicated. It's just no longer an option. My name is Erin Ward. I'm co-founder of ChurchReady, and we help local churches get ready for what AI is changing. In this video, we're going to talk about a scam that's already hitting churches in multiple states and what actually makes a church harder to target. Here's the scenario. A staff member gets a voicemail. It's urgent. It's the pastor, out of town for a funeral he's officiating, and he needs the church to wire an emergency benevolence payment for the grieving family before he steps into the service. The voice sounds like the pastor. Every inflection, every pause, just like him. But it isn't him. It's an AI-generated clone built from a few minutes of public sermon audio. And by the time anyone realizes that, the money is already gone. This isn't hypothetical. It's already happening to churches across the country. Recent research found that 6 in 10 church leaders are very concerned about AI voice cloning being used to defraud their congregation, and a quarter say it's already affected their church community. That's not a future risk, that's a current one. Carey Nieuwhof's new book, AI in the Future Church, makes the case that leaders need to decide what they stand for before AI exposes what they'll fall for. He's right, and that's worth sitting with. Integrity is being tested in ways none of us signed up for. This video is about a question that sits right underneath that. Whatever a leader personally stands for, does their church have anything in place to make that much harder to fake? Before we go any further, let's take a look a little closer at why this particular scam finds churches so easy. Because it's not bad luck, it's by design. Think about what a scammer actually needs to build a convincing clone of a pastor's voice. A few minutes of clean audio. And for most churches, that exists in abundance. Most churches have spent years building an archive that makes their own pastor easier to impersonate than almost anyone else in the community. Now, pair that with how churches actually operate day to day. Pastoral care runs on urgency. Somebody's in the hospital. Somebody needs benevolence funds released today, not next week. Staff tends to move fast when a need is real. That instinct is a strength in ministry. It's exactly the instinct a scammer is counting on when that same urgency shows up wearing a familiar voice. Add to that the reality that staff members or volunteers who actually answer the call was never handed a guide or any guidelines for what to do when an urgent financial request comes in. And the people most exposed on the other end of this scam aren't always the staff. Congregants get these calls too, especially the ones who are older or living alone or simply trust the pastor enough not to question him. The scam doesn't just threaten a church's bank account, it threatens the very trust of those the church cares for. Here's what it actually looks like when a church has already taken this seriously before anything happens. Leadership roughly knows how much of the pastor's voice already exists publicly. They've named that as a real exposure in a staff meeting because a risk that is named out loud is a risk somebody can actually plan around. An ignored one just stays exposed by default. Here's where most leaders get caught off guard. Most have heard the word deepfake by now, but there are a couple of assumptions that we find churches get backwards. The first is thinking a smaller church isn't a target, when a smaller church often has thinner staff, less formal processes, and a pastor who's generally easier to reach, which makes it an easier target, not a harder one. The second is underestimating their online sermon archives exposure to scammers using it as a training library for whoever wants to sound like the pastor. Now, with all of these AI scams, the church's mission doesn't change because of AI, but the infrastructure that sustains that mission has to. If you've never considered how AI disruptions will impact your congregation and church budget, the AI and the Future Church Readiness Assessment is the right next step. It only takes 10 minutes, and there's a link in the description. So let's take a look a little closer at what actually reduces this risk, because it isn't caution. Caution alone doesn't scale across staff or a volunteer team. The first way to reduce risk is building an actual verification standard. Most scammers depend on urgency arriving faster than verification. A church that means well but has never slowed down enough to build a verification habit isn't practicing good intentions, it's exposed by them. There's a verse in the Bible that says, "Every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." So, there's a simple standard we like to share with churches to help them get this right. No financial or sensitive request is ever acted on from a single channel, no matter how urgent it sounds or how familiar the voice is. Every request gets a second independent confirmation, a call back to a number already on file, not one provided in the message itself, or a face-to-face check with someone who owns this standard and who's responsible for enforcing it. The second way to reduce this risk is telling your congregation plainly and repeatedly what the church will never ask for by phone or text. Here's why this one matters just as much as the first one. A verification standard protects the organization. However, it does nothing for the organism, the congregation, the believers, who get a call that sounds exactly like the pastor asking directly for finances or money. You see, congregants were never part of the internal policy conversation. The only thing that protects them is having heard it in plain language that the church will never ask them for money by text or by phone. A church that's done this well says it more than once and says it more than one way. It's in the bulletin, it's mentioned from the pulpit once a month, and it's stated in the description of all of their social media channels as a simple statement of fact. We will never call or text you asking for any money, any wires, any cryptocurrency, or anything of the sort for any reason. The mistake we see almost every church makes is assuming this is obvious when it isn't, especially not to someone who trusts the pastor enough to believe he would really call and ask directly if something were urgent enough for that request. Silence isn't neutral here. It's the gap that scammers walk through. Putting a policy in place to protect the organization means nothing if the scammers just call a congregant or the congregation directly. You see, most churches understand all of this in theory, but almost none of them have ever written it down, assigned someone to it, or rehearsed it as an actual practice. The gap between knowing it matters and actually having a process for it is exactly where these scams live. The third way to reduce risk is knowing what's being said about your church or your pastor and ministry online. We actually add an extra layer of protection for churches we work with on this. Part of helping churches get ready for what AI is changing includes helping them with basic reputation management. So, if someone starts impersonating a pastor's name or a church's account online, that gets caught early instead of showing up as a call from a confused congregant after money has already gone. While nothing can promise to catch every fraud attempt, not watching for it at all isn't a wise strategy either. We have found something that surprises most pastors. It's not the large churches that get targeted the most. It's often the small to mid-sized ones, because a personal message that looks like it came from a pastor with a few thousand members or followers feels far more believable than the same message coming from a nationally known figure. Your church doesn't have to be large to be worth impersonating. It just has to be trusted. The misconception I see constantly is assuming that if a church isn't active somewhere, there's nothing to monitor. That's backwards. An impersonator doesn't need your church to have an active account on a platform. They just need your pastor's name, a few public photos, and a few minutes of some clean audio. The second misconception is treating the 3 ways to make your church a harder target as a one-time task instead of an ongoing practice. A fake account or an impersonation left alone for a few weeks can do real damage before anyone notices it. Now, there are 2 mindsets that must shift, and any one of them is enough to leave the door open for scammers. The first is treating this as a nice to know problem, instead of a real threat that deserves a response that matches it. The second is assuming it couldn't happen here, because your people know better, when trust is exactly what's being exploited, not a defense against it. None of this is complicated. It's just no longer an option. Pastors, you must make your church a harder target for AI scams. A verification standard, a congregation that knows what your church will never ask for, and a reputation that's being watched. That's what it looks like to guard the trust your church has spent years earning. Carey Nieuwhof is right that integrity has to be decided ahead of time. This is what deciding looks like when it's your whole church, not just your own heart. Until next time, lead well, steward wisely, and trust deeply.
The church's mission doesn't change because of AI, but the infrastructure that sustains that mission has to. If you have never considered how AI disruptions will impact your congregation and church budget, the AI and the Future Church Readiness Assessment is the right next step. It only takes 10 minutes. There is a link in the description.